So I thought I would talk a little bit more about kind of about propagation and the theory about propagation. We talked a little bit about it. We talked a little bit about seeds when we talked about the biology of a plant. But I think that it's really important to understand propagation, whether it be seed propagation or cutting propagation. And so that's what I decided to talk about, because it is very intertwined with the plant's body and plant science. There's different kinds of plants have, as propagators, we can choose different kinds of ways of reproducing our plants. And I know Kate brought in some lavender today to reproduce, but quite frankly, it reproduces better from seed than it does from cuttings. And cuttings only at a certain time of year. So what's the difference? What's the difference between seed propagation and cutting propagation? So most plants reproduce more of their kind through the production of seed, and that's sexual propagation, because what it involves is exchange of genetic material between the two parent plants through pollination, right? The pollen from one plant goes onto the pollen of another plant because the bee has carried it, and the pollen germinates on the pollen tube and then grows down and fertilizes the egg. And so, but many ornamental plants don't come true from seed because they've been hybridized. And so when you do a hybrid with a hybrid, it doesn't always come out to be what you want. It's almost like, again, almost like inbreeding. So quick review of the anatomy of a flower again. The stamen is the male part, stigma, female part, ovary is the bottom of the female part, protects the seed. The sepal wraps around the petals, holds the petals, and the petals, what do you think the petals are there? Are they there for our enjoyment?
Attract the critters.
You attract the pollinators, that's right.
There's
So,
a landing strip.
it's like, yeah. If you look on the internet, if you Google what an insect sees when it approaches a plant, I can't think of the exact words of it, but fool around with that. And they really see, like, you can't miss it. It's like a landing strip. What are the other kind of mechanisms you think that plants use to attract pollinators?
Thistles.
What's that?
Thistles.
Thistle?
Thistles, so that it catches onto the fur of other critters. That.
Yeah, so that's there's different flower forms and plant forms that assist in pollination. Like I said, the thistle will drag some of the pollen off. There's also some flowers where when the bee goes in, it has to go all the way in, and it's quite a tight flower, and to get out of there, it's got to dump some pollen. But what other critters do pollinating? Ants do pollinating. Yep.
Birds.
Birds, hummingbirds do pollinating. Somebody else said something?
I said birds.
Oh, you have birds too. Okay, we have a double bird. And other mechanisms that the plant uses is smell. Plants don't smell good for us. Plants smell good to attract pollinators. And you'll notice something curious that I've always really loved this fact is that plants that are pollinated by moths tend to be fragrant at night. And
it's not really like a lot of moth. They smell strong, like rotting things.
there's some, yeah, the things that are pollinated by flies smell like rotting meat. So another thing is that some of the flowers that bloom at night are bright white so that they show up. So there's all these strategies that have evolved over time for this pollination.
And we said wind, right? Wind?
Who has wings?
Wind?
Wind.
Is a pollinator.
Yeah, wind can be a pollinator, especially for conifers. Like some days you wake up in the morning and your car is full of this yellow powder. Well, that's generally conifer pollen. and it just blows around, and the tree hopes that it lands on the open female cones. There's male and female cones. So that's a very ancient and simple reproductive strategy. So the conifers existed before the gymnosperm. The gymnosperms existed before the angiosperms. So all the conifers existed before the angiosperms, the flowering plants with the ovules and stuff started. When you look at the history of plants. So they're more primitive, and the means of pollination were more primitive. It basically just threw it to the wind and hoped for the best.
You said that flowers look really good in ultraviolet, right? Kind of picture.
Oh yeah.
If anyone's wondering,
Yeah.
like, flowers look freaking amazing in ultraviolet.
And that's the way insects see.
Yeah,
Is
insects see
ultraviolet.
that.
So that's what insects are seeing.
Like, we think flowers are beautiful, but we got the boring stuff.
Yeah. Look at a picture of an orchid someday with from the insect view. It's quite amazing. So to increase numbers of plants, gardeners and horticulturists use asexual propagation as well. Because in asexual propagation, you get exactly the same. So you get a clone. When you take a cutting, you get a clone. It's going to be genetically identical to the plant that you took it off of. On the other hand, if you're growing from seed, it might have some slight variations in the genetics. It might have the basic same genetics, but the gene expression might be that slightly different. So if you want it to be absolutely exactly the same, you're going to take cuttings rather than grow it from seed. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to do this today.
High string to it.
This time. So asexual propagation involves everything from taking cuttings, leaf cuttings, African violets, taking cuttings of stems, all the way to grafting, which I guess you're going to do with some tomatoes, right? Yeah, I think you're going to do some of the tomatoes. If you look in your greenhouse book, there's quite an extensive thing on it, and Guy is convinced that you'll increase your yield of tomatoes. I personally am not so absolutely convinced, but I think it'll be a great, I don't think you have anything to lose. I just think it's very labor intensive myself, but I would love to see you do some both ways to see which way they do best.
Will you show us how to graft trees?
Can I show you how to graft trees? Yes, I can show you how to graft trees, but I'm not sure I want you doing it, because when I taught grafting before, I ended up having to haul the first aid kit around all the time.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah, I mean, invariably out of 20 students, we'd have 6 that had to go to first aid.
That's all right.
So, I mean, really, some actually had to have stitches.
Oh, no.
So, you know,
You know,
I'm a little ambivalent about teaching grafting. In fact, they eliminated it from the curriculum.
No, I worked with a surgeon who said famously, or infamously, all bleeding ends eventually, Kate. Really?
Yeah. Well, I guess he sees the extreme of that. But, yeah, the thing about grafting too is that in my experience, grafting trees, now grafting herbaceous plants might be a little bit different and easier. We'd have 25 students, they would each do 25 grafts, and probably out of that, 10 grafts took, and they were all the same student.
Oh, wow. Someone had a skill for it.
Yeah, it's almost like playing the violin.
Right.
You know, with grafting trees, is that some people just have it, you know, and other people just cut themselves. So, you know, so I'm a little, I can show you, and I can show you what I can show you that's safer is budding. Budding is inserting a bud from one plant into a similar plant, making a little teacut and then wrapping it. And that's much easier and much safer, and can be just as, if not more effective. than actually grafting. So, yeah, so we can fool around with some of that. I'll look and see how we can do that. I'll have to get some kind of a tree. Yeah, I'll think about that and I'll make sure that we at least demonstrate it. So sexual propagation always involves the exchange of genetic material, and it's often the cheapest, quickest, easiest method of producing plants is just throwing some seeds out. And sometimes it's the only method of producing new varieties, maybe the only way to propagate some species. And an advantage with seeds is it prevents the transmission of diseases usually, because they usually go dormant and die off while the seed is just sitting there. Whereas if you're taking material from a tree, you might or might not notice that it has some disease. Diseases sometimes are not immediately visible, and so you could be transferring disease without knowing it. So propagation is the most commonly known method of producing plants, perennials, annuals. What was the definition of annuals again?
Their life cycle lasts 2 years.
1 year. Biannuals?
2 years.
2 years. Perennials? Many years. And sometimes perennials will not produce seed the first year. They'll just produce structure. And then they're different than biannuals in that after that first year, they will produce seed every year. Whereas biannuals will produce seed the second year and then die. Perennials will sometimes not produce seed the first year, will produce it the second year, and then every subsequent year. Now, of course, lawn is grown from seed. Here's another little picture, big picture of a seed. Here's the seed coat. Water has to get through the seed coat somehow. Some plants have very tough seed coats. Sometimes you have to actually scratch the surface of the seed coat so that water will actually go into that seed to wake up the endosperm, which then feeds the embryo, which then starts to grow. And the root comes out of this side right here. Here's the radical, and it'll emerge from that side there. So if you do have seeds that you have to scratch the seed coat, you want to do it on the side away from what's called the scar. And you can see a little dent, or you can see a little line or